Alright, I'm just going to make a note before this video starts. It's going to be split into two sections. Part 1 is more about modeling theory, whereas part 2 is more about how to get a nice render going in Blender 2.8 with Eevee. So some people will find part 2 more interesting than part 1. It's going to be more of a time-lapse format. So I'll leave a time down here in case you want to skip ahead. Now with that being said, enjoy the video. Hi everyone, today we have a request video. Starfleet2360 commented saying, I've been trying to build a completely custom Star Trek style corridor for a while, but I need help with modeling concentric corridors. Do you have any tips on how to achieve that? Well yes, of course, let's do it. Let's have a look at some reference imagery and floor plans to see what we're dealing with. We've got some nice looking blueprints and floor plans here to give us a nice idea of what to make. When it comes to making concentric or circular corridors, we need to keep a few things in mind, mostly design related decisions that need to be made. We need to think about whether we want all of the corridors to have the same width, and how large we want individual segments to be when we break this down, because if we want to construct a circular corridor in a game engine or anywhere else later on, it would be best to have a modular tileset to work from. If we want to make it modular, then we have to make sure that the pieces will fit together perfectly. It's quite an easy thing to get wrong, because if you make the segments too long or too short, you will eventually end up with some overlapping when bringing the circle to a close. This will require a tiny bit of calculation to figure out how long our segments could be. Don't worry, it's nothing too intensive and I'll walk you through it. So let's move over to Blender 2.79. Probably the most common way that people start to develop circular corridors is with a cylinder. When we make one, in the bottom left we can choose the number of vertices that make up the circumference. This is an important number to remember. If I apply the creation and go into edit mode, we can see at the top that the number of vertices is actually 64, double what we chose. And that's because the cylinder is a 3D object that has been extruded, meaning that there are two rings of 32 vertices connected to each other. Now one thing to remember is that the number of edges around the circumference of the cylinder is the same as the number of vertices around the circumference as well. This makes it a lot easier to calculate the size of segments. Now what I'm going to do is just make this shorter, inset the caps at the end, and bridge them using loop tools, which is an add-on that's already packaged in Blender 2.79. You just have to activate it in your user preferences by going to add-ons, then typing in loop tools, and you will find it there. Just tick the box and then save user settings. Once we've bridged these, we can start to visualize this as a circular corridor. But now comes the part of starting to build modular pieces. I'm now going to demonstrate to you why we need to do a little bit of calculation. Our example ring has 32 faces around the edge. 32 must be divisible by the number of face loops I want to turn into a corridor segment. For example, if I took one face loop, duplicated it, and separated it into another object, I could take this away and I know that I could perfectly reconstruct the ring with it, because the number 1 clearly goes into 32. However, we encounter an annoying difficulty. Angular snapping isn't helping us to get these segments lining up properly. Thankfully, when doing transformations, Blender actually lets us type in the exact degrees we want to rotate the object by, so if we know the degrees, then we will have no trouble in getting them to piece together properly. The actual calculation we need to do is here. The circumference edges divided by the segment edges equals the number of segments, and then 360 divided by the number of segments will give you the angle of rotation, otherwise known as the degrees required to snap the segment next to its neighbor. So if we apply this to our current example, 32 divided by 1 equals 32. I struggled with that one for a bit. 360 divided by 32 is 11.25, and this is our angle of rotation that we need to apply to our segments in order to get them to line up properly. So going back to our scene, if I duplicate a segment and press R, then Z, and then on my numpad press 11.25, you will see it rotate and place itself perfectly next to the original segment. You don't need to enter the numbers on a numpad though. Blender will also let you use the regular numbers as well if you don't have one. If we repeat this, they will continue to rotate into the correct place. Now, 1 was probably too simple an example, so let's do that again with a different segment length. I'm going to choose 4 instead this time. I'll duplicate, separate, and move it over. Alright, now the angle snapping is actually being nicer to us here, because we can just hold Control and get it into the right place. But you're not always going to be in this situation. So what we're going to do is go ahead and figure out the numbers for this one too. 32 divided by 4 is 8. 360 divided by 8 is 45. So if I take a segment and rotate it on the Z-axis by 45 degrees, it will fit perfectly into place. Now anyone with experience in angles could easily eyeball that one, because you can see that the edges are perfectly halfway between the major axes, so it's bound to be 45. But now, to point out why the total number of edges around the circumference of the circle must be divisible by the number of edges in a segment, we're going to do an incorrect example. So for this, I'm going to choose the number 5. 32 cannot be perfectly divided by 5, because the result is 6.4. The angular snapping is also having trouble helping us here. So let's calculate. 32 divided by 5 is 6.4. 360 divided by 6.4 is 56.25. So let's see what happens if we keep rotating these segments by 56.25. Notice here that before I even put the last segment down, you can already see what the problem is. It's not going to fit, and if we wanted to put a segment there, then there would be some overlap. And that is exactly why they must be divisible. So now that we've got that boring angular theory out of the way, we can start talking more about the actual construction. You will have to personally make a decision for how long you want your individual segments to be, as well as how many edges you want to allocate to it. Clearly, the more edges a segment has, the smoother the curve of the wall will look from the inside. But also, if we wanted to create junctions in and out of our circular corridor, then we would need to find space to make them. Now, a decision that I would make if I was making a tile set for my own projects would be to keep junction and wall segments the same length to make things as interchangeable as possible. If they were different lengths, then we would have to be considerate of balancing empty space elsewhere in the ring. This is because of the important rule of modularity that I taught in part 2 of the Building a Sci-Fi Corridor in Blender and Unity series. The rule is, when you fill empty space, you create empty space. You should go and watch it if you haven't. I mentioned the rule at 18 minutes and 20 seconds through the video. So, if we actually wanted to start making a tile set, we could take a segment of our desired size and turn it into a basic piece, and then create variations from it. This is where creativity can take you in a limitless number of directions. But what if we want to connect one circular corridor onto a larger circular corridor, while also making sure that both corridors have the same width on the inside? Well, this is where we need to have another look at the inset operation. Inset is where we press I on our keyboard to duplicate the edges of a face and bring them inwards by an equal amount. In the bottom left, we can change the thickness parameter of the inset. I've got 4 cylinders of different sizes here, and I've also reset their scale by pressing Ctrl plus A, just to make sure that there will be no scale distortion when we do operations. It's very important to reset the scale of the object if you change it in object mode, because it will change how the inset operation behaves. Now what I'm going to do is go through each of these and inset the top cap face at a thickness value of 0.1. After that, I will join them all into one object so we can see them all together in edit mode. If I lay them over each other, what we should see is that the thickness of our potential corridor ring is equal across each of the objects, despite the rings being different lengths. So what this tells us is that if we want to do concentric corridors with different lengths while maintaining the same interior width, we need to remember the inset thickness value and make sure it is shared across all of the corridors. Now that's all well and good, but if we took a ring like this and decided to make a corridor from it, then we would end up with straight walls. If we want to be a bit more fancy, we can do a lot better than that. As we know in Star Trek, there are a lot of curved walls in the corridors. Having curved walls is also much more clinical and is generally more satisfying to look at, as it provides more angles for light to bounce off the surface. So keeping that in mind, how would we achieve curved corridor walls and divisible modular segments while also maintaining the same width across all circular lengths? Well, you could just take the cubic profiles that we've been working with, chop segments out of them, and then curve the walls manually, but how would you possibly know if you were curving them by the right amount without even more annoying calculations? That would be very painful and kind of unnecessary, but don't worry, I've had a trick up my sleeve the whole time. I'm going to show you a shortcut to getting all of the above, but don't tell anyone, this is just between you and me. We're going to make use of some curve functionality. We will create a cylinder, just like before, with the appropriate number of sides that we want, remove a ring of vertices so we're only left with one ring, convert it into a curve, give it some depth to turn it into a tube, and then we're going to work from there. I'm going to go with 256 vertices. Then I'll move it down, remove the lower ring, and then in object mode, press Alt plus C, and then convert it into a curve. In the Curve Properties tab, I'll make the Fill mode full and crank the depth up to something like 0.05 and the resolution to 12. If we were doing multiple concentric corridors, we could duplicate this object and use the offset parameter to increase or decrease the length of the tube while maintaining the same width. Now, we press Alt+C again and convert this back into a mesh. We could put a solidify modifier on it now if we wanted to preserve an outer and inner wall. I'll do that now with a value of 0.005. Then we create a box that we are going to use to cut out the curved walls. In this case, we want a flat ceiling and floor to match our references. I'll leave an equal amount of space above and below the cube, and I make sure that no part of the ring is left out. I'll expand the sides until everything is covered. I select the ring and add a Boolean modifier. For the object property, I use our new cube. Looking in wireframe mode, we can see that the operation is slicing off the top and bottom of the ring. I apply it and delete the cube object. We are now left with a sliced ring. Now we can pick out and remove segment walls. Notice, however, that the upper and lower flat areas created by the solidify modifier are n-gons, as the front and back walls do not have connected vertices. If you wanted to keep them on your segment, you could remedy this by selecting vertices and pressing J to join them properly, but you might not need to do that since there aren't many places where an interior viewer would be able to see them from the inside. We will choose the number of face loops that we want to make our segment. I'm going to go with 4 because I know that 4 definitely goes into 256 64 times. I'm going to fill in a flat floor and ceiling and prepare this as a segment of my tile set. With that being done, we'll do the quick calculation to figure out what the rotation angle of our segment should be. 256 divided by 4 is 64. 360 divided by 64 is 5.625. So now we know our angle of rotation. We can test it out by repeating the segment in a circle. And here we go, a modular curved corridor with curved walls, ready for more detailing. If you wanted to make a longer or shorter corridor, all we would need to do is duplicate that original tube created from our cylinder loop and change the offset value of the curve without touching the depth. This way, we will make sure that the corridors share the same width. Now, I hope this has helped you understand how to construct circular corridors with some angle theory, although I thought it might be a little bit anticlimactic to leave the video here without showing you something pretty. So what I'm going to do for the last part is going to go into time-lapse mode, where you will see me adding more details and then making a comparison of a beautiful render between cycles in Blender 2.79 and then Eevee in 2.8. So that's going to start right now. Alright, so here are the results. I did a render in both cycles and Eevee just to see what the difference would be. Obviously, there's a lot of bouncing light going on here, so cycles will give us much more clarity, but Eevee definitely held up pretty well considering it's a completely real-time engine, so I'm quite happy with that. If you want to get your hands on this corridor piece, you can get it for free on my QBrush store page. I hope you've learned something today, and if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell, and I'll see you in the next video.